From a supposed genius to a criminal mastermind, Keith Raniere built an empire of manipulation and control that spanned decades. With his charm and intellect, he lured the rich and powerful into NXIVM, a group promising personal growth and empowerment. But behind the glossy exterior, a darker truth was lurking, one of abuse, psychological warfare, and a secret society where silence was bought with the ultimate cost. As women were marked and broken, Raniere's influence grew, creating a world where trust became a tool for destruction. So how did this charismatic leader manage to deceive so many for so long? In today's case, we dive deep into the twisted reality of NXIVM, exploring the psychological tactics used, the hidden signs that went unnoticed, and the chilling story of how power, money, and control created the perfect storm. Join us as we uncover the truth behind one of the most shocking cults of the 21st century. Geoi. In 2017, a New York Times investigation ignited a firestorm that would forever change how we view the blurred lines between self-help and exploitation. The article revealed the true nature of a seemingly benign organization, NXIVM. Originally marketed as a self-help group dedicated to personal growth, leadership development, and empowerment, NXIVM had attracted a wide range of high-profile members, including heirs to vast fortunes, CEOs of influential companies, and even Hollywood actors. These individuals believed they were joining a network designed to unlock their full potential, with promises of enlightenment, business success, and personal fulfillment. But behind the polished veneer of success and self-improvement, there lay a much darker truth. NXIVM's charismatic leader Keith Raniere portrayed himself as a genius, a man capable of transforming the lives of anyone willing to follow his guidance. He was not only the founder, but also the self-proclaimed vanguard of the organization, and his word was law. His intelligence, his charm, and his ability to persuade others to believe in him were central to his ability to control and manipulate those around him. Raniere sold himself as the embodiment of intellectual and spiritual superiority, framing his teachings as revolutionary, his insights as life-changing. But what started as a respectable, if unorthodox, self-help group gradually revealed a much more sinister side. Beneath the surface of inspirational seminars and motivational courses lay a system of psychological control that bordered on cult-like behavior. Over time, Raniere's followers found themselves entangled in a web of manipulation that few could escape once caught. Those who dared to question or leave were systematically silenced or discredited. At its core, NXIVM wasn't just about personal growth, it was about control. The group's teachings evolved to focus not just on empowering individuals, but on breaking them down. They were encouraged to confront their personal vulnerabilities, which were then used against them, making them more susceptible to Raniere's influence. For some, it became a full-time obsession, a commitment that left them financially and emotionally drained, often to the point of isolation from friends and family. One of the most chilling aspects of NXIVM was its secret subgroup known as DOI, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, translated as Master over the Obedient Female Companions. This group was not revealed to the public until later, but it was here that Raniere's true manipulation reached its most dangerous form. DOS was a secretive and insidious cult within NXIVM where women were coerced into becoming sex slaves for Raniere. To join DOS, women were required to provide collateral, personal, often embarrassing, or incriminating information that could be used to blackmail them if they tried to leave. This collateral ranged from private confessions to explicit photos, or even written contracts transferring ownership of their assets. The power dynamics within NXIVM were unmistakable. Raniere was at the top, his followers were subjugated, and the ones who held the most power were those closest to him, including his most loyal followers, who helped enforce the system. Allison Mack, a former actress best known for her role on Smallville, became one of Raniere's most devoted followers and a key player in recruiting women into DOS. She, along with others, helped maintain the structure of coercion, becoming complicit in Raniere's crimes, while believing they were part of a noble mission. What made NXIVM so dangerous wasn't just its teachings or its membership. It was the skillful manipulation of human psychology, which made people want to believe in something greater than themselves, something that in the end enslaved them. The group's success was built on the idea of personal growth and empowerment, masking a system of control that preyed on the most vulnerable. At the outset, NXIVM seemed to be a normal, albeit unconventional, self-help organization. But the contrast between its outward image and its underlying purpose is what makes this case so profoundly disturbing. The manipulation was subtle, and it was incredibly effective. What began as a pursuit of personal betterment for many individuals evolved into a cycle of psychological control and sexual exploitation. The transition from a self-help group to a cult was gradual, often unnoticed by those involved until it was far too late. This case deserves psychological analysis because it highlights the complex ways in which individuals can be manipulated and how easily normality can mask the most horrifying of truths. The juxtaposition of the innocent exterior with the dark reality that lay beneath it is a key insight into the psychology of criminal manipulation. What appeared to be a movement for self-improvement was in reality a carefully constructed system designed to break people down, control them, and use them for the benefit of a single individual. The true horror of NXIVM was not in the physical violence, but in the subtlety of the mental and emotional enslavement it imposed. As we begin to peel back the layers of this case, we start to see the extent of the manipulation that took place and the true nature of the predator at the center of it all. In the years leading up to the creation of NXIVM, Keith Raniere's life was marked by a series of behaviors that suggested a deep-seated need for control and validation. His journey to becoming the leader of a destructive cult was not an abrupt one, but rather the culmination of a lifetime of manipulation, charm, and calculated decisions. Raniere was born in 1960 in Brooklyn, New York, and his early years gave little indication of the dark path he would follow. Describing himself as a genius from a young age, Raniere cultivated an image of intellectual superiority. His parents, eager to support his self-perception, began treating him as exceptional, early on telling him he was gifted and comparing him to figures like Jesus. This was the foundation for his eventual manipulation of others, a child raised with the belief that he was above others, intellectually and morally. Raniere's childhood was marked by the deep psychological impact of his parents' treatment of him. His mother, a ballroom dance instructor with a history of substance abuse and heart problems, became an emotional crutch for young Keith. As a result, he often stayed up late caring for her, developing a nocturnal lifestyle that would continue into adulthood. His father's career in advertising and his mother's emotional instability set the stage for his future behavior. Raniere's need for control and validation was reinforced by his formative years of receiving special treatment and the feeling that he had to care for those around him. This duality, being placed on a pedestal while simultaneously required to fix others, became central to his psychological profile. During his adolescence, Raniere's charm became a tool for manipulation. His interactions with girls were calculated and controlled as he would charm them into believing they were special and unique. This behavior suggests that even at a young age, Raniere understood how to exploit vulnerabilities and use charm to gain influence. He did not view these relationships with any deep empathy. Instead, they were part of his strategy to increase his control over others. In his early adulthood, Raniere turned to business ventures, each of which contained warning signs of his future exploitative practices. His first major business venture, Consumers Buy Line, was a multi-level marketing scheme that ultimately collapsed due to legal and ethical issues. This failure did not deter him. Instead, it seemed to reinforce his sense of invincibility. He learned that he could manipulate people into following him, whether for financial gain or to fuel his own ego. His next business venture, National Health Network, similarly relied on questionable tactics, selling nutritional products, while using exploitative methods to recruit new members. These ventures were not just about financial success, they were about creating a following, learning how to control those around him, and subtly bending them to his will. From a young age, Raniere's sense of superiority and control over others was nurtured by his upbringing and early relationships. His narcissism, combined with a lack of genuine empathy, enabled him to view people as tools to serve his needs. His ability to manipulate women, particularly by making them feel special, points to a predatory mindset. His charm wasn't just about winning people over, it was about using their vulnerabilities to gain influence and power. This emotional and psychological manipulation was the precursor to the more dangerous systems he would later create. The formation of NXIVM in 1998 was the turning point that marked Raniere's transition from a businessman with questionable ethics to a leader of a manipulative and harmful cult. The organization started as a self-help group, initially attracting individuals who were looking for personal development and empowerment. Raniere's promises seemed innocent enough: unlock your true potential, achieve success, and grow emotionally and spiritually. However, as the organization grew, it became clear that the teachings were designed to control rather than uplift. NXIVM's recruiting strategies were meticulously planned. It started by targeting wealthy individuals, executives, and influential figures, people who were already predisposed to believe in the idea of self-improvement. Raniere knew how to prey on their desires for success and fulfillment, using the promise of personal growth as bait. These individuals were encouraged to go deeper into the teachings, often participating in expensive seminars that promised transformation. The vulnerability of these individuals, wealthy and high-powered, yet still seeking meaning in their lives, made them ripe for manipulation. However, the key turning point in NXIVM's development came with the formation of DOS. This secret subgroup within NXIVM began as a hidden layer of control, one that went beyond personal empowerment and delved into sexual exploitation and subjugation. Raniere started using DOS to control women in even more insidious ways. The women were recruited into a system where their loyalty was proven through the submission of personal collateral information that could be used to blackmail them should they ever leave or speak out. The collateral could be anything from compromising photos to personal confessions, and it made the women completely dependent on Raniere's approval. The psychological tactics used in DOS were designed to break down the women's sense of self-worth. They were forced into extreme diets, kept isolated, and pressured to perform degrading acts in exchange for Raniere's affection and approval. The women believed they were part of a secret empowering system, but in reality, they were pawns in a game of psychological control. The turning point here was the formalization of this system, which combined psychological manipulation, physical coercion, and sexual exploitation, all under the guise of self-help and empowerment. Raniere's behavior from his early business ventures to the creation of NXIVM and DOS reveals a gradual escalation from manipulation to control. What started as an innocent self-help group evolved into a full-fledged system of emotional and physical enslavement. The turning point lies in the implementation of psychological tactics, breaking down individuals' self-worth, isolating them from their support systems, and using collateral as a tool of power. The line between helping and controlling became increasingly blurred, and what appeared to be a benign group became a calculated step towards emotional, financial, and sexual exploitation. This transformation underscores the psychology of a manipulative leader, how subtle coercion can gradually become an all-encompassing force. As we delve deeper into the psychological dynamics within NXIVM, it's crucial to examine the behavior of the victims, particularly the women involved in DOS, and the role key figures like Allison Mack and Nancy Saltzman played in perpetuating the group's system of control. Raniere's manipulation was not just about imposing power. It was about reshaping the personal narratives of his followers, making them believe their actions were part of a greater noble cause. Understanding this manipulation is key to unraveling the complexity of the crime and the psychological consequences for those involved. The women who became part of DOS were not initially recruited with the promise of sexual exploitation. Instead, they were drawn in by the group's core message: empowerment through self-help, personal growth, and mastery over their lives. These women, many of whom came from privileged backgrounds, sought a sense of belonging and the opportunity to improve themselves. They were looking for answers that Raniere was more than willing to provide. The psychological manipulation began gradually as Raniere and his inner circle used methods that seemed innocuous at first. NXIVM's teachings encouraged vulnerability, urging members to share their personal secrets and fears as part of their path to self-improvement. However, this created an opening for Raniere to use their weaknesses against them. The more vulnerable they became, the more dependent they became on the group, and more specifically on Raniere's approval. In DOS, this manipulation reached its peak. The women were required to give collateral personal confessions, compromising photos, or even financial assets to ensure their loyalty and silence. These collateral agreements were not just documents, they were psychological chains. For these women, the threat of their personal information being exposed if they ever left or spoke out became an unbearable burden. What had started as an aspirational journey for personal growth now became an emotional and psychological prison. The women's deep emotional investment in the group made them particularly vulnerable to Raniere's control. They believed that their actions, no matter how degrading, were part of a higher cause. The psychological toll of this manipulation was immense, as the victims were coerced into viewing themselves not as exploited individuals, but as empowered women in a secret sisterhood designed to transcend the limitations of society. This cognitive dissonance, the conflict between their outward behavior and their internal moral compass, kept many of them trapped in a cycle of obedience, even when they could recognize the abuse. Allison Mack, best known for her role on Smallville, played a pivotal part in the NXIVM drama, transitioning from a Hollywood actress to one of Raniere's most devoted followers. Initially, Mack was drawn to Raniere's promises of personal growth and intellectual superiority. She viewed him as a mentor, and eventually she became one of his most loyal supporters, recruiting women into DOS and helping to solidify its power structure. Mack's psychological transformation is both fascinating and tragic. As a public figure, she was already accustomed to being admired, but Raniere offered her something deeper, an ideological framework that gave her life meaning and purpose. In many ways, she became a victim of the very manipulation she helped carry out. Raniere exploited her personal vulnerabilities, including her desire for validation and belonging, using them to pull her deeper into the web of NXIVM. Mack justified her actions within the group by convincing herself that she was helping women achieve a higher state of self-actualization. She believed that by recruiting others into DOS, she was empowering them. This delusion, reinforced by Raniere's teachings, allowed her to continue to act as a recruiter and enforcer within the group. The fact that she was an actress accustomed to being seen as a role model added an extra layer of complexity to her involvement. Her public persona was in direct contradiction to the actions she was taking behind closed doors, but the psychological conditioning she underwent made it difficult for her to reconcile these two realities. As NXIVM's true nature began to unravel, Raniere's psychological state shifted from confident manipulator to desperate leader. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. His final attempts to maintain control over his followers became increasingly extreme. He isolated the women in Dios, pushing them to perform degrading rituals, including sexual acts, and forcing them to adhere to rigid diets that endangered their physical and mental health. Raniere's desperation to maintain control is a clear reflection of the psychological toll his manipulation had taken on him. The more his empire was challenged, the more his behavior became erratic, seeking even greater levels of submission from his followers. His need to dominate emotionally, psychologically, and physically was no longer about empowerment, but about preserving his authority at all costs. His manipulation tactics became more brutal, with women subjected to physical and emotional punishment if they failed to comply. The key turning point in this phase was Raniere's loss of influence outside of his immediate circle. As more women left NXIVM and began speaking out, Raniere's once impenetrable control began to fracture. But instead of backing down or attempting to mend the damage, Raniere clung to his power, becoming even more coercive and repressive. His actions became a desperate attempt to hold on to the loyalty of the women he had manipulated so successfully, even as the truth of his crimes became undeniable. The psychological complexity of Raniere's manipulation is evident not only in his direct actions, but also in how he reshaped the personal narratives of his followers. Figures like Allison Mack were psychologically entangled in his web, convinced that their actions were for a noble cause. As Raniere's empire began to collapse, the psychological stranglehold he maintained on his followers only deepened. They justified their actions no matter how extreme because Raniere had made them believe they were part of something greater. The psychological cost of this manipulation was immense, not just for the victims, but for those like Mack who became both the victim and the perpetrator, lost in the web of control they had been coerced into believing was their path to enlightenment. In any complex criminal case, there are often gaps, missing pieces of evidence, unreported incidents, and unexplored motivations that can obscure the full truth. The NXIVM case, with its insidious manipulation and covert operations, was no exception. While some aspects of the investigation were meticulously pursued, there were key details that remained hidden both by design and due to systemic limitations. The silence within the records, be it from law enforcement, the media, or the victims themselves, speaks volumes about the nature of the crime and the profound psychological manipulation at its core. One of the most puzzling aspects of the NXIVM investigation was the loyalty of certain key figures, even after the group's public collapse. Some of the most influential members, including those at the highest levels of the organization, remained steadfast in their support of Keith Raniere, despite the mounting evidence of abuse and exploitation. These individuals did not simply walk away, they continued to defend him and the organization's teachings. This unwavering loyalty is a significant gap in the case, raising questions about the depth of Raniere's psychological control over his followers. The question of why such loyalty persisted is not just a matter of personal allegiance. It speaks to the profound psychological hold Raniere had on his followers, one that transcended the typical devotion to a leader. His ability to reshape their sense of self-worth and identity had a lasting impact, making it difficult for them to reconcile the truth about his actions with their own beliefs about the organization and themselves. The victims, often brainwashed and manipulated, were left in a state of confusion and cognitive dissonance, where accepting the truth meant losing everything they had believed in. Furthermore, the investigation into Raniere's personal records remained incomplete. Some of his private communications and financial documents were either never retrieved or remained out of reach. Surveillance footage that could have provided insight into Raniere's interactions with his followers, especially during the crucial moments when the truth about Dios began to surface, was either never made public or was mysteriously absent. These gaps in the evidence raise troubling questions. Was there a deliberate effort to hide or destroy incriminating material? Or were these critical pieces simply overlooked by investigators? During the investigation, there were also numerous instances where reports were delayed or incomplete. The silence surrounding these documents points to deeper issues within the legal and investigative processes. Was it negligence, or was there an unspoken reluctance to delve deeper into the truth, perhaps due to the power and influence that Raniere held over certain sectors of society? These missing pieces are not just about lost information. They are about what is deliberately left unexamined or ignored. The limitations of the investigation into NXIVM were also shaped by the broader systemic context, both legal and societal. NXIVM operated with a level of secrecy that made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to uncover the full extent of the abuse. The organization had the resources to shield itself from scrutiny, using its wealth and connections to deflect attention and influence key figures. NXIVM was not just a small-time operation. It was a complex network that included powerful, influential individuals who were able to protect the group from the full force of legal investigation for years. This included some members who had vast financial resources and social connections, which could delay or derail legal action. Moreover, the psychological manipulation at the heart of NXIVM created another layer of difficulty. For law enforcement, identifying the true nature of the organization required an understanding of the psychological tactics that kept its members loyal, even in the face of mounting evidence of abuse. This was not a simple case of physical violence or traditional criminal behavior. The psychological dynamics that Raniere used, guilt, coercion, isolation, created a situation where the victims themselves were reluctant to speak out, often trapped in a cycle of silence and shame. The investigation, despite its early successes, was hindered by the victims' own hesitation to testify against the leader they had been conditioned to worship. There was also the issue of timing. Law enforcement was not equipped to handle a case involving such sophisticated psychological control. In the early days, NXIVM presented itself as a legitimate business with a self-help agenda. By the time investigators fully realized the extent of the crimes, many of the key players had either left or closed ranks, making it harder to piece together the full scope of the organization's operations. The silence within the record speaks to more than just the gaps in the investigation. It reveals the deep psychological conditioning that had taken place over the years, not only with the victims, but also within the system itself. Raniere's ability to keep his followers silent, even after their exit from the organization, highlights the power of psychological manipulation. For many victims, the fear of retaliation, whether it was the exposure of compromising material or the destruction of their social standing, kept them from speaking out. For those still inside the organization, the silence was a tool of control. Raniere knew that if he could maintain control over the flow of information, if he could keep his followers from communicating with the outside world or with each other, he could maintain his power. The victims were conditioned to stay silent about the group's activities, and for many, breaking that silence was an incredibly difficult psychological barrier to cross. This manipulation of silence is one of the most insidious elements of the NXIVM case. The silence is an integral part of the NXIVM case, and it is not limited to the missing records or the unreported incidents. It reflects the psychological hold that Raniere had over his followers and the role that silence played in maintaining control. The gaps in the investigation, the missing evidence, and the unanswered questions all point to a much deeper issue: the power of manipulation and the ways in which it can seep into every corner of a system, whether it's a cult, a community, or a legal system. The silence in the records is not just about missing data. It's about how Raniere and his followers manipulated the truth to preserve a narrative that kept them in control. Understanding this silence provides a crucial insight into the psychology of power and manipulation, showing how even the most powerful systems of control rely on the absence of information to maintain their grip on those they seek to dominate. The NXIVM case, while legally resolved with the conviction of Keith Raniere and other key figures, remains open in many respects, not because the criminal justice system has failed to deliver justice, but because the psychological story of this manipulation and control is far from complete. As more victims come forward and new techniques are applied to the investigation, the full extent of Raniere's manipulative tactics and their impact on those involved continues to unfold. This case is not simply a criminal story. It is one that sheds light on the complexities of human behavior and the power dynamics that allowed such an operation to thrive for years. In recent years, technological advances have provided some new insights into the case. DNA analysis and genealogical studies have been used to trace connections and identify individuals who were once hidden in the shadows of NXIVM. These developments, particularly the DNA identification of women who were branded, have allowed investigators to track down more victims and create a more detailed picture of the cult's operations. However, despite these advances, technology cannot explain everything. It can reveal identities and unearth previously hidden facts, but it cannot provide the why behind Raniere's actions or the motivations of his followers. Psychological insights into the behaviors of those who joined and remained in NXIVM are not easily uncovered through data alone. The question of how Raniere managed to manipulate so many individuals, especially intelligent, successful people, is one that remains largely speculative despite the increasing volume of evidence. The lingering silence in the records, the unaccounted-for psychological tactics, and the complex relationships between the leader and his followers all contribute to the continuing need for analysis. It is clear that the case is about more than just a criminal mastermind running a pyramid scheme. It's about understanding the intricate web of psychological manipulation that allowed Raniere to sustain his control for so long. In many ways, the psychological story of NXIVM is still being written, and as more survivors step forward, the pieces of this puzzle will continue to come together. While the legal questions surrounding the NXIVM case may have been resolved, the psychological exploration is far from complete. The what and how of Raniere's criminal behavior are well documented, but the why remains elusive. It's not enough to simply understand that Raniere manipulated his followers. We must ask what allowed such a manipulative system to persist unchecked for years. What drove intelligent, successful individuals to follow a man whose actions clearly crossed ethical and legal boundaries? And how did Raniere's methods evolve into the coercive, abusive system that NXIVM became? Understanding the psychological complexity of this case is essential. It's not just about uncovering a list of victims and perpetrators. It's about examining how human psychology can be warped and manipulated by a charismatic figure. The lessons to be learned from this case go beyond the details of NXIVM itself. They speak to the nature of control, submission, and influence, and they offer insights into the vulnerabilities that exist in all of us. While we now have a clearer picture of the actions taken by Keith Raniere and his followers, many aspects of the why remain speculative. What motivated someone like Raniere to take these actions? How did his followers justify their involvement in such an exploitative system? These questions highlight the limits of our understanding, especially when it comes to understanding the psychological mechanisms that allow people to commit such abuses and how they can rationalize their behavior. The psychological impact of this case extends beyond the individuals involved. It has far-reaching implications for society as a whole, highlighting how power can be abused under the guise of something as innocuous as self-help. The case also serves as a stark reminder of the danger of placing blind trust in authority figures, especially when they cloak themselves in the language of empowerment and personal growth. The very systems that promise to help individuals grow were the ones used to control them, making this one of the most disturbing aspects of the NXIVM case. The true value of analyzing this case lies not in achieving a definitive conclusion, but in exploring the subtleties of human behavior and the ways in which manipulation can take root in even the most sophisticated and well-organized systems. Some questions, particularly about the psychology behind Raniere's actions and the reasons behind the victim's continued loyalty, may never have clear answers. But the process of exploring these questions is what deepens our understanding of the systems at play in human interactions and crime. It is this understanding that can help us recognize the warning signs of such manipulation in the future, and perhaps prevent it from happening again. As we continue to analyze the case, we must accept that not every question will have an answer. But by confronting the complexities of this case and considering the psychological elements that shaped its narrative, we gain a deeper insight into the dark power of manipulation and the resilience of the human spirit.